The number of short-term rentals has skyrocketed since 2020. The demand for short-term rentals created more competition for anyone wanting to buy a single-family house, and this contributed to the inventory shortage and the higher home prices that we see today. Now, because short-term rental investors expected big profits with the cheap mortgage rates back then, they could pay more for a house than a buyer planning to just live there. Well, neighborhoods absolutely loved the home price appreciation that these short-term investors helped to create, that is, until the parties started showing up every weekend. And HOAs and local governments nationwide have been trying to ban these short-term rentals ever since. But is there trouble brewing for the short-term rental industry? And is this industry collapsing as the cost of owning and operating these short-term rentals seems to be outpacing profits? Well, to discuss this, I have financial analyst and author of several books, one being How to Profit from the Coming Real Estate Bust, Mr. John Rubino. Now, John writes a Substack, which I'm subscribed to, and all of his information is in the show notes below. So let's bring in John. This show is brought to you by Sachs Realty Education. Here you can find my Todd Simple Home Buying course. It's packed with insider secrets teaching homebuyers how to save potentially tens of thousands of dollars when buying a home and how to avoid costly mistakes. The link is pinned in the comments below. John, welcome back to our podcast.
Hey, Todd. Good to be back.
So short-term rentals took America by storm. How in the world did that happen?
Well, it was a very appealing idea at one time. You know, when Airbnb first came along, there were basically hotels and motels, and that was it. But if you had like an extra bedroom in an apartment or a house, there was no way to monetize that, or a guest house or an RV, and Airbnb allowed people to get cash for those things. You could rent out a room in your apartment, or, my very first Airbnb experience was in an RV park next to the owners of that RV. They had another RV right next to it. And, they invited me over for dinner, and we hung out and drank wine and everything. I felt like I made new friends. And so it was a great experience. I gave them a 5-star review, and that was the way it originally worked. It was this quirky, kind of interesting new way to find a place to stay when you were in an unfamiliar town. And it became popular. And with good reason. It was kind of a cool idea, but it eventually morphed into something completely different. Today's Airbnb, Airbnb isn't the only platform for stuff like that. There's bookings.com and other ones, but they basically have turned into something higher end, in theory, but also way more complicated and expensive because there are cleaning fees and all kinds of other rules that are attached to it. And that's stirring up a lot of controversy and changing the attitude of the public because, if you go to a hotel, nobody bugs you about anything. You just leave the towels on the floor, you hand the key to the guy at the front desk, and you leave. And if you're on vacation, that's how you want it to be. You don't want to spend an hour cleaning your guest accommodations before you go somewhere and then worry that you didn't do a good enough job, so they're going to charge you extra. And that's kind of how Airbnb is now. So it's becoming kind of an inferior product in a lot of ways, and that's hurting the market for it. But at the same time, over the past 10 years, it's become this get-rich-quick scheme for Airbnb entrepreneurs, people who wanted to be landlords, who didn't just have, the spare room to rent out. They build up 5 apartments or 3 houses or more in some cases. And so they have this little real estate empire that, as not being hotel people or even real estate people in a lot of cases, they went into it without knowing all the pitfalls that they were going to face as they got bigger and bigger. So now there are thousands of Airbnb entrepreneurs out there who aren't generating anything like the cash flow that they might need to pay off the debts that they took on to buy these properties. And a lot of them are going to, this is why it's important for the housing market. A lot of these guys are going to have to start shedding inventory. And some of the other ones are going to go bankrupt flat out. And the banks get back all their apartments and all their houses and things. And that's going to add potentially pretty massively to the homes for sale inventory that's out there. And what we've got right now is a frozen market in a lot of ways because prices are insanely high. Hardly anybody can afford today's starter houses at the current price and the current mortgage rates. So there's not a lot of deals being done. But if inventory starts going up, which it actually is across the board, but if Airbnb problems add dramatically to the inventory that's out there, then prices have to be cut to move that inventory. And then you see, if something is wildly overvalued, that means there are air pockets under the prices of it before you get back to fairly valued. And we're kind of in that situation now. And so trouble in the Airbnb market could contribute to serious trouble in the broader housing market that leads prices to drop dramatically.
Well, I want to take one step back. You were saying on how, and you're right. I mean, you rent an Airbnb. I've done it. And you have this laundry list of things that you have to do. It's like 15 steps before you leave or something. But an important thing that goes along with that, you now get a social score from these hosts. So now if you want to continue to rent Airbnbs, if you're not a good actor, they give you a bad rating. And it's kind of like the Uber guy, right? Does he really want to come and pick you up if you have a very bad rating where, for whatever reason, right? John, do you think that, and right, I mean, it's not just Airbnb, it's VRBO. I mean, the list goes on, and they've been around for a long time, like you mentioned. Do you think that short-term rentals are good for communities?
Well, actually, that's the other problem with this whole concept is, they're not good in a lot of cases for communities because you end up, people, if it's a vacation resort town or something like that, people buy properties there, not to live there, but to rent out. And you end up with, basically, if you're in a neighborhood with a lot of short-term rentals, you have no neighbors to get to know because it's a new set of people every week or every 2 weeks or whatever. And a lot of the people that come in, they don't have any long-term connection to that place. So they party hard, they break things, they're just not good neighbors in the aggregate. And that's really ruining a lot of small towns and other countries, in fact. Spain is having mass civil unrest right now because of the amount of tourism, which is exacerbated by the number of short-term rentals there. So they feel like their culture is being ruined. And on a smaller scale, that's happening in a lot of other places too. And the town councils and the mayors and in some cases the governors are looking at this and considering new limitations on short-term rentals. So they're going to shrink that market one way or another in order to make those places livable again, which makes it that much a harder business for somebody who's an Airbnb entrepreneur, who wants to have a little empire of properties, and a lot of places just won't let them do that anymore. I mean, it just makes the business tougher, and that adds more units to the inventory that's out there. So it's a problem for the short-term rental business, but it's also a problem for the bigger housing market, the broader housing market. And we're seeing the effects of that now on a small scale, but it could be a much bigger scale over the next couple of years.
You had said a lot of the Airbnbs now are high end, and you're right. I mean, people are spending $1 million or more to live in a community, and they have this nonstop partying going on. But there have been a lot through the recent years. For instance, Dallas banning short-term rentals, and then they overturned it because, of course, everybody's screaming property rights and you can't do that. It's unconstitutional to do that kind of thing. I want to play a little clip here now. In Fox 13 Tampa Bay in Pinellas County, Florida, there are new code proposals for short-term rentals that could actually remove the occupancy cap. So right now it's capped at 10 people per home, but they want to make it, Pinellas County, they want to make children under 12 exempt from that that type of occupancy. So it could be quite possible you could have 25 people in the house if the occupants are bringing their children for the weekend or the week on vacation. But I want to play this clip and then get your opinion on this.
Parties, drugs, and noise. That's what neighbors say they're dealing with in their Pinellas County community because of a vacation rental. And they want the county to know that expanding how many people can actually stay in a home is a wrong move. Fox 13's Genevieve Curtis spent her afternoon in the community speaking with neighbors ahead of what is expected to be a fiery meeting next week.
Imagine living next door to a 24/7 bachelor party, 365 days a year. That's what one mom tells me it is like living next door to a short-term rental. And she's worried that proposed changes in Pinellas County could actually make the problem worse.
There's no commonality. There's no neighborly respect.
Trespassing notices are not the decor Hillary Simpson would choose for her backyard. But this video of a man jumping over her fence before being chased away by her dogs is just one of the many reasons why it's up.
And it's unsettling because I don't know the people next door. There's no form of background check.
What do you think of this?
I think there's money to be made in short-term rentals, and governments know that. They make tax revenue from it. And presumably the politicians locally get contributions to their reelection campaigns from this industry. So obviously there's pressure to make it easier in some cases for short-term rentals. But I think the overall trend is against the business right now, just because of what you just saw or what you showed us on that video. That would be a nightmare to live in a place like that. So they lower property values, other things being equal, right? I mean, how do you sell a house if the people who might be buying your house know what's going on next door when it's a short-term rental? So you'd have to hope they don't know that. They don't find out. All the short-term renters are quiet while you're showing the house. And I think the overall trend is against short-term rentals. And there's one other aspect to this too that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the damage that gets done to these units by people who are, it's like a rental car to them. You drive it hard, ding it up, whatever, who cares? And you see all these videos online about people saying, all right, here's my wall after the last renter was here, and there's a big hole in the wall, and here's my TV, and the TV's off the wall and broken and everything. So, if somebody breaks your stove, let's say, in your rental, that's going to cost you thousands of dollars maybe to replace it. So you're not making any money at all if that's the kind of thing that happens more than once every 5 years. And it sounds like it's more common than that. So these rosy cash flow numbers that a lot of the how to become an Airbnb host videos and companies show you, probably don't take that into account. Like the extremely high maintenance on one of these units probably turns cash flow negative for a lot of these places. And that just adds to the pressure on these guys who got into it, bought a few houses back when, and refinancing costs are probably the final nail in the coffin, where a lot of these houses and apartments were bought with very cheap money in the previous decade. And now if you need to refinance, you're looking at going from, let's say, 3% interest to 7% interest. And if your cash flow was barely positive previously, now it's sharply negative. So I predict a lot of bankruptcies and just in general, a lot of inventory coming from this market and depressing prices dramatically. So, once you see something like that coming, it's hard not to start thinking, all right, how far down does my dream house have to go before I step in and buy it? Because, if you're in the market for a house right now, it's a very unpleasant experience. Everything is crazy expensive. And actually, side story, my wife and I are looking into getting houses for a couple of our kids, or at least helping them get houses. And when we see what a starter house costs right now, we still have in our mind what we paid for starter houses back in the 1990s, and it's just appalling. It's 3 or 4 times more than what we paid for a completely acceptable house back in the day in order to get a similar house for one of our kids. And that's just crazy. And everybody's facing that same problem. Boomers own the vast majority of houses now in the country, because they were able to buy them back when they were only 1/3 as expensive as they are now. That's the biggest source of embedded wealth in the United States is boomer houses. And so which is a whole other part of the story, because boomers are, we're getting up into the period of life when sudden illness is a normal thing. And in my neighborhood, something is happening now that I've just noticed in the last couple of years, where it's a lot of retirees in pretty pricey houses, thanks to appreciation over the past decade. But one thing that's happening is, say you got a couple who's in their 70s, one of them gets sick and dies. And then the other one immediately puts the house on the market because they're in no position to handle a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot house on 2 acres of highly manicured lawns and things like that. So they need to downsize immediately. And so the house goes on the market. And the other thing is, boomers who had kids in the area, maybe that's why they moved there. Well, the kids move away and then start having grandkids. And the boomers want to, grandma and grandpa want to be by the grandbabies. So they put their house on the market and buy something smaller in, let's say, Florida or something. So those are two new but dramatically growing sources of inventory that's going to hit the market in a much bigger way in the next few years, because, the math is undeniable. The average boomer is late 60s right now. And that means lots of them are in their 70s. And that's the part of life where, just demographically speaking, just historically speaking, you start to downsize, or your health forces you to downsize, one or the other. Either you do it voluntarily, or the doctor kind of forces you to do it with the diagnosis, whatever it is. And so that's going to add massive inventory going forward, and a lot of it high-end inventory, because like I said, boomers, bought nice houses 20 years ago, and those are very high-end houses now in terms of price. So the McMansions that are going to be hitting the market are going to find basically no buyers at today's prices, right? Because what Gen Z kid or a millennial can buy a $900,000 5-bedroom house? There are very few out there that have the money to do that, unless they're getting money from grandma and grandpa. So the amount of inventory that might come from boomers is really shocking when you think about it, because we collectively own like 30 million houses. And that's a huge part of the overall U.S. housing stock. And there's no way around it hitting the market in the coming decade, and a lot of it in the coming few years. So that's going to be a very big deal too. In some cases, they're going to be as panicked to get out of their houses for various different reasons than the Airbnb guys will be. So there's going to be a lot of panic selling going on, as people find that they just have no choice to sell. They have to get out. And if today's price isn't realistic, well, they're going to have to take what they get. And in a financial market, and houses are a financial market, those are leveraged assets in a lot of cases, which means their market price can vary widely, because you're not talking about necessarily the whole value of the house. You're talking about the money that you put down to get that mortgage. And that allows the overall value of the house to swing wildly. And, that happened last time around. You had houses drop by 40% in a lot of previously hot markets in 2008, 2009, 2010. And there's no reason to think why something like that couldn't happen again, with demographics being what they are, with short-term rentals being the not so great market that it's turned out to be. This could be a fascinating time for people who are buyers. It's not a terrible time for sellers all of a sudden, but it might be a great time. Let's say 2 or 3 years from now, might be one of those times when the banks are just overloaded with inventory that they got to blow out at whatever the market will bear, and you can step in and buy something that feels spectacular right now, for a really good price. So my wife and I are looking forward to that day for getting houses for our kids.
Yeah, well, I've often said, what are they going to do with these McMansions other than bulldoze them down? Because as these boomers, as you described, and Yahoo Finance published an article last year where they said they're expecting 30 million boomers to retire in the next 5 years. That's a lot of households that, just like you were saying, that will hit the market. But they're big houses on average, and the millennials and Gen Zs, they don't want these big houses that they have to sink all their money into paying to heat and cool these big houses. And so, yeah, I mean, other than turning them into multifamily buildings, I don't know what they're going to do. You'd also said something about these Airbnb hosts expecting a wave of bankruptcies. There is on NOLA.com, they just published an article. And check this out. It says Airbnb purges New Orleans short-term rental listings as new rules kick in. Airbnb and some operators are suing the city over new rules, though hoteliers applaud the restrictions. And basically, what they're saying here is a purge of short-term rental listings in New Orleans has begun. A purge. And so what's happening is they are forcing Airbnb, if they don't have a permit to have an Airbnb in New Orleans, Airbnb has agreed that they will kick these operators off the site. Now, this phenomenon that's taken place, I mean, if you go before Airbnb or VRBO became what they are right now, and they make billions of dollars, right? If you go before that, you had to put your house with a management company to manage your vacation rental, to turn it into a short-term rental. Maybe you went a couple times a year, but the rest of the time you rented it, but you paid big rental fees. Now, Airbnb and VRBO has made this possible. Can you imagine being an operator and the platform that gets you all of your income, pretty much, right, now has to kick you off if you don't have permits? Airbnb is going to have to probably raise their rates because, I mean, they're not used to needing to monitor or being fined by cities or potentially fined by the municipalities for not abiding by these rules. So now they have to add this whole new department probably to monitor or the compliance of these Airbnb hosts on their site. But even to your point, this other bizneworleans.com website, they published an article in May that says short-term rental company files for bankruptcy. Now, John, the crazy part about this is it says that the bankruptcy filing indicates that Romy has about $5 million in assets, but that its liabilities are about $15.9 million, right? And they're basically saying that I guess these permitting issues or being limited on what they can have in a block or an area for short-term rentals is sort of now constraining these hosts that they're causing. In some ways, I mean, I don't know it's a direct cause, but I mean, look at this. This is crazy. 5 million in assets and 15.9 million in liabilities. How did that happen?
Lots of things like that happened in the past 10 years when money was super cheap and banks were just handing it out to anybody. And so what happens to these homeowners and apartment owners who are renting them out when it becomes impossible anymore, and New Orleans is an example of that. You got to sell, right? I mean, if you don't live there or you only live there part-time and that's financed by renting it out the rest of the time, you got to put that thing on the market. And you don't have the option of going, well, I'll wait for 9 months till the perfect offer comes in. You have to tell your realtor, listen, I need to be out of here. I've got another mortgage over here. I can't carry both at the same time. Just figure out what it takes to move this thing. And see, that's the panic part. That's the early panic part of a housing bust. When people just start saying, listen, I got to be out of this. And I will take what I can get. And then the realtor, knowing that, goes to people and says, motivated seller, and any offer will be considered. And so you get extreme downward pressure on houses in that little pocket of the market. And then potentially it spreads. So starts in New Orleans, moves to Seattle, and then it's nationwide at some point. So again, that's the story of the next 2 or 3 years, probably. Housing has been so quiet because home prices have just gone up a little at a time. There are very few deals getting done, but prices keep going up, and they're so outrageous that a lot of people have given up. They're not even paying attention anymore to what a house costs, and it's going to become noisy. People are going to start saying, "Oh, look at this one! It's marked down 32% on Zillow. It's going to be fun looking up the downgrades on Zillow and places like that." But that's going to be the story of the market. And then once the banks have to step in and take a lot of these busted properties back because they defaulted on their loans, then the real bargains start happening. And and like I said, I'm looking forward to that. But I think it's going to be brutal for a lot of people. Yeah. Because this is when smart operators like you step in. You're waiting for the bust, right? Because
no Airbnbs for me, man. I don't want to be fighting with the neighbors.
Property is property at a certain point, right? If it's cheap enough, whatever it is, you can step in and make a lot of money.
I have done the residential rental market. I don't care to go back. I've gotten rid of all my I guess after this year, I'll have gotten rid of all of my rental properties, residential rentals. I was never a big operator, but I beat my head up against the wall for years. In fact, one year my accountant said to me, like, "Why the hell are you even doing this?" Because a lot of them were in Baltimore. The tenant turnovers were painful, cost you a lot of money. And, I think the ship has sailed because of the profiteering over the last really 3 or 4 decades. And we could talk about that, of what really spawned flipping and things like that. But do you, just before we move on, do you think, let's talk about the act of someone telling you what you can and cannot do with your property. Do you think that's right? Let's just say for the situation of this New Orleans host filing bankruptcy, New Orleans forcing Airbnb to kick people off their site. Obviously they let this happen in the first place. And you said municipalities, when we were covering the Pinellas County, the Florida, a lot of these municipalities have profited too big time by, look, you got a homeowner that's bitching about their neighbor having parties, but that one that overpaid for that Airbnb, they paid more than an owner occupant would pay, because you could profit big by Airbnb, right? So they, not like your traditional long-term rental, they overpaid and won the bid in a lot of cases to get that Airbnb. So the neighbor who's pissed about the parties next door, in a lot of ways, profited from that host paying a lot more money for that next door house. They benefited by the appreciation. Now what you're saying, they're going to have their butts kicked because the host is going to liquidate that house and change the neighborhood comps, because somebody's probably going to come in and now swipe that equity away by an undervalued purchase. But do you think that the municipalities now that allowed it to happen in the first place, do you think it's right for them to then come crashing down on the existing hosts versus, or eliminating short-term rentals versus grandfathering them in because they did allow it to happen, and then making new regulations preventing them moving forward?
Well, yeah, that's, I think, the argument that's taking place in a lot of cities and towns right now, right? Exactly. How do you want to fix the problem that previous zoning laws have caused with the short-term rental market? And I imagine the different cities will try different combinations of new rules. And some of them might be grandfathering those guys, existing units in. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem of the really pissed off people who are around those units. So if you're a councilman or something like that in a town, you're going to be hearing from those people if you don't fix this immediately. So the path of least resistance might be just to say, screw it, no more short-term rentals in this area. We just changed the zoning laws so that it's owner occupied only. And that quiets things right down, raises property values. Well, raises some property values, lowers the property values of the things that used to be highly lucrative short-term rentals, but it calms things down. So I think as non-confrontational as I am personally, if I was one of those city councilmen, I would want to just end it, make all the people stop yelling at me and get it over with. But
or just hide. I think, don't call them back. I've had that happen when a couple of councilmen I've reached out to, they never got back to me for various reasons. Decided not to call me back.
Yeah. So we're in a period of experimentation right now where everybody's trying to address the problems of short-term rentals, but there's no perfect formula. So people are going to try a lot of different things. And, 10 years from now, we will know which ones succeeded and which ones didn't. And then the ones that didn't can just steal the ideas of the ones that did. So it'll work itself out. But, in periods of change, there's never a perfect solution because everybody has different ideas about what the best solution would be. And you kind of just have to have competition to work it out. The laboratory of democracy. Everybody tries their idea. And then we find out over time what is best. So I don't know what zoning law will be perfect to fix this problem. And we'll just have to find out over time.
I have recently, I've been doing a lot of research on history of the housing market and really just kind of diving in and saying, how did we get to where we are right now? And it's interesting because when we had, after World War II, we had this boom of, houses weren't investments, right? They were to live in. People bought one to raise their family, to have a safe place, to build community roots, things like that. And what happened was, this is back in the 40s and the 50s. And then about 20 years later, we have all of these houses that are about ready to be renovated, right? You live in a house for 20 years, you need to update it, right? It's 20 years old. And we had a lot of new technologies like the microwave, just things that changed the way that we live. And what I have found interesting is that the magazines back in the 60s and 70s really are what started a lot of this desire to renovate a house, to make it more valuable than what it is, to bring it up to current day life and amenities. And then we had, so that kind of started it. And then we had the 80s spawned this DIY network, right? So they introduced the idea of buying a property that's outdated, maybe one of these 40 or 50-year-old houses, and then spending money in them, fixing them, and then flipping them, right? We had that phenomenon that really kind of spawned mainstream entertainment of these HGTV type shows. And that was sort of like the 80s into the 90s. And then, of course, next thing you know, a house is really for profiteering. It's not just to live in. And then we had at the same time all these regulations that had come to be that have sort of increased the size of the home because builders couldn't make a profit unless they were building bigger square footage houses. But the question that I have for you is, should houses be investments at all? Should they even be something that is, a Wall Street line item where, hey, look, we can buy these, we can profiteer on them at the backs and the risk of making things unaffordable for people and sort of controlling the market? Should that even be allowed?
Well, this is what inflation does. It turns things that should not be speculative assets into speculative assets. And that happened big time with housing, because housing is leveraged, so you can make a ton of money if the price of the house that you just put down 10% on goes up. And that's spread through the whole of society. And yeah, I agree with you 100%. Houses are things you consume. They're basically the safe place that your family has to be, where the rest of the world doesn't affect them. It's a very important thing culturally, but it's become a really important thing financially, because we screwed up the financial system. As the dollar's value goes down at an accelerating rate, houses are starting to be seen, or have come to be seen, as a safe haven asset and speculation, a thing that can make you a lot of money. And that's because the financial system is broken. And, the housing market hasn't changed. We still need houses for the reasons that we always needed houses. But now we've kind of seen them as, oh, you buy a house and then that's your nest egg. It becomes worth massive amounts of more money than you paid for it. And that is not how things like that should work. And I think there's a decent chance that this generation is the last generation for which that works that way, because, we're going to have to do a monetary reset in the not too distant future, where we take away the government's power to just create money out of thin air. Whether we go back to a gold standard, or we have a Bitcoin standard, or something else, I don't know. I would like a gold standard personally, but it could be any number of things that we go to. But the key feature of it is going to be that it basically prohibits inflation. It forces the government to maintain the value of the currency. And then that takes the speculative interests out of houses, right? Because then houses go back to something that, as you said, you buy it, you live in it, and then you have to renovate it. And there goes your home equity. You didn't actually make any money on that 30-year stretch, but you got a lot of non-monetary benefits from having a house. So we'll go back to that once we reset the monetary system. But in the meantime, we have the bust that flows from the latest bubble. And, hopefully the housing bust is in the mix of data points that teach people that inflation is a horrendous thing, and that we need a stable money, not a money that's inflated away continuously. So to the extent that it helps with that argument, then this coming bust is a good thing. So it's good in two ways. It lets us buy a cheap house at some point in the future, and it teaches us as a country about inflation and why inflation is evil and why we should never let it happen again.
Well, John, you wrote the book on, it was a couple of years ahead of time, and it's hard to time these markets, but you wrote the book about how to profit from the incoming real estate bust. And in fact, it happened. I mean, your prediction was spot on, just a couple of years too soon. But we do know that how the delay of these things can take place. And we've seen where that's kind of happened in today's time, right? Where, probably at least 1 million plus households have benefited by some type of remodification of their mortgage in order to not see foreclosure, or we would already be seeing what myself and other people have called for as a housing market crash several years ago. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that we are in some type of a repeat, if you're talking about a monetary collapse or reset. So going back to your book, what does that monetary, you said if we go back to a gold standard or Bitcoin standard or what have you, what type of, are you expecting that? Are you expecting a monetary bust, and are you expecting another housing market crash? Maybe not like what we had, because we don't see the foreclosures, but are we looking at still another housing market asset crash in the near future?
Well, yeah, we have to have a monetary reset because this monetary system is broken, and monetary resets have happened many times in history. It's not a really unusual thing. You just lop a couple zeros off the currency and go forward, or you change the way the central bank reserves are counted, and in our case, we could, if we went back to a gold standard, which has been the way we've done it for most of human history, you just define the dollar as a certain weight of gold. So maybe 1/10,000th of an ounce, which means gold's price is $10,000 an ounce. And then you make those two things exchangeable. The government promises to exchange gold for dollars and dollars for gold at that exchange rate. And that, without going into the really deep weeds here, that forces the government to not create currency out of thin air and do all the things you do with money made out of thin air. Government has to live within its means going forward. And the value of the price of the dollar, the exchange rate of it, just stays the same going forward. So inflation goes away. Now, what that means for housing is we probably don't get the kind of bust, the crazy bust that we got in 2008, because this isn't a super frothy market. Today's real estate market is kind of a frozen market. So we have to have a repricing where the value of a house in real terms goes down dramatically, because that's going to be muddied a little bit when the value of the dollar is falling really dramatically, and then they're trying to decide where to reprice gold to get on a gold standard. So you're going to have a lot of cross currents that change the numerical value of houses in ways that are hard to understand at the moment. But the real value, in other words, the inflation adjusted value of houses in the US has to fall dramatically. So one way to figure out how that's progressing is to compute the gold value of a house. So if you say, instead of how many dollars is this house, you say, how many ounces of gold does it take to buy this house? And that gives you a real value for the house. And you know what? Houses are actually down when compared to gold over the past 20 or 30 years. In other words, this last housing bubble where home prices went up dramatically was an illusion created by a fiat currency that was being inflated away. But in terms of real money, like gold, homes actually got cheaper over the past decade. And I suspect something like that will happen going forward too, where houses get even cheaper versus gold, although they might go up versus the dollar, but that's because the dollar is going down at an accelerating rate. So, pricing houses going forward is going to be a little tricky for a while. But if you want to clarify it, you just price houses in gold, do that calculation, and then you can figure out what is really happening in that market.
Interesting. What do you think the chances are us ever going back to a gold standard?
I think 95% that we have a monetary reset, where we take this monetary system, which is broken, and we change it in some way that gives us a chance of normality returning. Whether it's a gold standard or not is going to be a big debate. It's going to be really interesting when that happens, where a lot of people are going to say, "Oh no, Bitcoin should be the base money of the future of the world." Let's go to that. Or somebody else says, "Okay, let's make a basket of commodities, and we price our currency versus this basket of oil and uranium and copper and things like that." And I would say that a gold standard, where the dollar is just a name for a certain weight of gold, is by far the simplest way to do it. Both because it's got one variable, gold, and it's been done. We saw how it worked. There was a thing called the classical gold standard that lasted in some form for a couple of hundred years, and in its purest form for several decades prior to World War I. And it was brilliant. We had not only zero inflation, but we had deflation. The price of stuff went down year after year after year during that period of a gold standard. And international trade was really easy because everybody was basically valuing their money the same way, and they called that the golden age. And World War I screwed everything up. But if we went to a gold standard in the form that existed prior to World War I, everybody would know how it would work. It would be understandable because it had already been done. And the results of it were so great at the time that we would be able to predict with some certainty when we're trying to sell the idea that we would have a zero inflation, maybe even slightly deflationary world of high growth going forward. So I think the gold standard is the easiest sell. And because of that, I think that's probably where we end up. But it'll be an interesting debate going from here to there.
It'd be an interesting journey to that point, too, because a lot would have to happen. You'd have to see the dollar collapse, right? I mean, that would have to be something that would have to take place. So sounds like that could be I don't know. That sounds a little wild to me, man.
Here's a scenario for how it might work. Let's say that housing starts to go down, and that causes a lot of bankruptcies, and then commercial real estate, especially office buildings, tank. And that screws up a lot of the balance sheets of the local and regional banks. A lot of them start going bust. The government has to step in and bail them out. That's several $1 trillion of a bailout. And then people around the world start looking at us and going, wow, we already have insane amounts of government debt in the U.S. And now there's another $3 or $4 trillion to bail out the banking system. Do we want to hold this currency? And money starts pouring into gold and oil and whatever currency the BRICS countries are operating with, and many other things that are real and can't be inflated away. And the dollar and the other fiat currencies just start falling in value versus those real things. And at that point, the government has to do something to stop the disorderly decline of the currency, because that makes interest rates go up, which would bankrupt everybody who has variable rate debt. So they can't let that happen. So they have to do something. And at that point, a monetary reset becomes the least bad alternative. They're looking at some horrendous choices, but going back to a gold standard seems to be the least crazy one, because that's the one that doesn't result in a 1930s style deflationary depression or a Weimar Germany style hyperinflation. That's the one thing that's understandable and that might work. And so at that point we do it, But we've seen a lot of unlikely things happen lately, like the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, something that nobody thought would happen. Trump is doing all kinds of wild things out there that are just they would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. So maybe we just add the gold standard to that list of previously unthinkable things that this administration is doing. And one last part of this is that Trump has a lot of gold bugs in his cabinet. There are a lot of people that are around Trump and advising him who already believe in some form of a gold standard. So it's not as crazy as you think when you consider that Trump is very unpredictable, and he's got people who are telling him, yeah, let's go back to a gold standard. So anyhow, sorry, long-winded answer, but it's an interesting subject.
Well, I think it's, it's a conversation that's worth exploring and listening and learning about. Getting back to, you had mentioned something about commercial loans. It hasn't been that long ago, John, where, this was like mainstream news, right? Saying, hey, we have a commercial real estate crisis on our hands, because a lot of people, when you're dealing with commercial loans, most of the time they're 5-year loans. They're amortized over a 25-year period with a 60-month balloon. Sometimes you could find a bank to give you 10-year terms, which I was fortunate enough in a couple of my commercial purchases to do, rental purchases. But they have already now, that time's up, right? So, in one situation, I had my bank didn't want to refinance my property because they didn't want that type on their books anymore, right? Their appetite had changed for that type of investment to refinance. So they gave me a period of time to pay them off. Why don't we hear about this anymore? We saw commercial loans go from 4% to 8%. And at the same point that we watched vacancy rates explode, office buildings are empty. We're starting to see these properties going back into receivership with the lender, but we're not hearing anything about this. We're not hearing about the collapse of commercial real estate anymore. What's going on with all of that? It just kind of like went away.
Part of it is that another sector of commercial real estate is booming. That is data centers for AIs. That's suddenly the value of them has exceeded the value of the office buildings in the country. So you've got this boom going on in a different part of commercial real estate, which makes people less worried. And we haven't had any really big blow-ups in the office building market yet, where it's front page news. But there have been a ton of buildings changing hands at crazy discounts, right? It was $100 million in 2018, and now it's $22 million or something like that. You see stuff like that all the time.
But John, not to interrupt here, but what about the fact that a building owner's note is due and they have to refinance it and it's no longer 4% and the value of the building is no longer what it was when it was full? Are they just not calling the notes? Are they just letting them continue to pay what they've been paying all along? I mean, why aren't we hearing of this implosion going on?
Well, for the banks, the path of least resistance is probably just to quietly refinance a loan, right? But what that does is, because the value of the office building continues to fall, what that does is it increases the unreported loans or unreported losses that are on bank balance sheets, because that paper is getting worse and worse with time. And then that's not the kind of thing that can go on forever. So at some point, there's a blow up. Some real estate company goes bankrupt, and then everybody starts looking around to see where that paper is, and they see it's on these 3 Pennsylvania banks or something like that. And those banks see a massive outflow of depositors because they know those big loans are going to have to be taken. And then everybody starts looking around and going, which bank is next? And they find some more banks, and then the bank run spins out of control. And we haven't seen that yet, but we have seen bank runs in the past, right? And we know how they go. Yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley Bank was very recent. And if the government hadn't bailed them out, that would have caused a bank run across that sector, the local and regional banks. So you reach a point where you can't avoid this stuff. Market bubbles don't go on forever. They go on longer than you think they should. That's just the nature of a bubble, that it goes on until all the naysayers have been drummed out of the market or turned into bulls instead of bears. And then it blows up. So
we had the commercial real estate crisis then that's probably still looming. And that was one of the components that you were saying towards the monetary reset, because once we start seeing the bank default, the loans default, and the bank's not being able to cover them, the government has to bail the banks out like we've seen happen. And that just increases all the debt. So I'm getting that. And now we're talking about getting back to the potential short-term rental bust. It's hard to get an exact number on how many short-term rentals there are in the U.S. However, there is a site, I'll pull it up here. It's consumeraffairs.com. And this is kind of like old data again. I mean, it's very difficult to find real estate data that's up to date. But it says the U.S. short-term rental market is projected to grow about $81.63 billion by 2033, and that nearly 2.5 million rental listings, over 785,000 individual hosts, facilitated 207 million nights spent in U.S. short-term rentals in 2023. These are big numbers. 785,000 individual hosts, 2.5 million rental listings. So with the the expectations of boomers retiring, selling their houses, downsizing, now taking this, already inventory rising nationwide, new builders not being new home builders, inventory rising. They're kind of like in a sales gridlock, and a lot of them are offering all kinds of concessions, including like 4%, 5%, 30-year fixed rate mortgages. So that's not cutting sales loose. Oh boy. I want to talk. That kind of gets me. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to compare the 2.5 million units to the normal monthly existing home sales number in the U.S. right now, because that's like 400,000. So you've got a number of potential new units coming onto the market that dwarfs the number of houses that sell in a normal month. And that's just from this one sector. So in the boomers, 30 million houses, that also dwarfs the number of houses that are normally sold in a given month. So, you've got the potential here to swamp the existing buyers that are out there, right? And it's coming from a lot of different sectors. And you mentioned home builders too. They're stuck with a lot of raw land that they got to do something with, right? So the number of houses that are in some stage of being built right now also dwarfs the monthly home sales out there. So you've got, when you add it all up, a number of potential houses coming onto the market that totally dwarfs the number of buyers that are out there at any given time. So, if you saw another 200,000 houses come onto the market, that's 50% of the buyers that exist right now. And they're already, stuck with the 400,000 that they were going to buy. So, the response that you would get in a market from that much new inventory coming on would be a plunge in prices. And that's very easy to envision when you see the numbers of potential units for sale that are out there right now. So, and yeah, we haven't really talked about the home builders yet, but as you said, they're cutting their prices via incentives and stuff like that, to the point where, I'm not 100% sure I remember this stat correctly, but it was something like the average new house now is $40,000 cheaper than the average used house, the one that's an existing house for sale. And you can't have that go on for very long, right? Because new houses have to be more expensive than non-new houses, or the market just doesn't work. So home builders are in kind of a bind right now, that is forcing them to sell their houses. And, it's also probably forcing them to cut back on the quality of their building, too. I don't know that for a fact, but that would be a logical response to having to give all these incentives to people to buy your houses. You would use cheaper lumber or cheaper flooring, or scale back the appliances that you're putting in the house. You need to cover that somehow. And so that's lowering the quality of the housing stock at the same time the price is falling. So it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah. I agree. Getting back to the short-term rental business, I found this very interesting. I found that there's the site, you've heard of them, I'm sure, AirDNA, and they kind of cover all of the platforms. They published something August 27th that said short-term rental bonus depreciation in 2025, what you need to know. And just to kind of go over bonus depreciation, basically what that allows people to do is do certain upgrades or renovations to investment properties and write off that expenditure, what they spend, all at once, and take a big potential tax break as a result of fixing up these short-term rentals. And as we know, one of the problems with short-term rentals, and if we look at how many that have been bought since 2020, it's probably about time that the furniture is starting to look a little rough, right? So maybe they got to go in and buy $10,000 or $15,000 worth of new furniture. But the key takeaways of this article, I wanted to get your opinion on it. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act restored 100% bonus depreciation in 2025, letting Airbnb hosts and short-term rental owners fully deduct qualifying asset costs. Properties that qualify as businesses may use the short-term rental tax loophole to apply bonus depreciation beyond rental income. And then it says with the bonus depreciation in 2025, percentage set at 100%. It says now is the time to plan upgrades, place assets in service, mean buy them or convert long-term into short-term, and reduce your tax bill. So I guess the question that I have here is this going to increase as we know that these short-term investors competed with our homeowners, helping to raise asset prices of houses? The prediction is that the short-term rental is going to increase, but we say, well, how will that happen? Profits are lower. These types of things are going on. But then you see something like this that is giving them the ability to spend money or to put more assets into short-term rentals to take advantage of this 100% bonus depreciation benefit for 2025.
Well, see, that's the U.S. trying to prop up a failing business concept via the back door, instead of just saying, hey, we're going to give the short-term rental people money. You just quietly cut some tax for them. But a tax break is not cash sent directly to you. You have to spend the money, and then you get some percentage of that money back on your taxes. So
and you got to make a profit, and in order to take the tax break, you have to be profitable.
Yes, and so if you're cash flow negative, this helps a little bit, but at the end of the day, you still got a failing business. And to the extent that it brings more people into the business, that just makes it harder for the existing people, right? Because once you're in a business, you want barriers to entry. You want a moat around that business that stops other people from coming in. And part of what the government did here was make it easier for people to convert existing units to the Airbnb format or whatever. They can now make it a short-term rental unit more easily than they could have otherwise. And that's, other things being equal, a problem for the guys who are already in the business, because they really don't need more competition right now. And if they get more, that means their cash flow diminishes, because the competition that's coming in is probably all spiffy and new, right? Recently remodeled or recently built or something like that. And, so in other words, it will not bail out a failing business. If you're already cash flow negative with your Airbnb portfolio, you may be a little less negative, but you're still negative. And you still got to do the refinancing, which you don't know how to do. And you still got to do the upkeep up front. You don't get that money back completely in taxes. You have to pay most of that up front, and then you get some portion of that back in taxes. So it doesn't save you. This part of the economy is going to have to shrink going forward. So it's just a question of how it shrinks, slowly and in an orderly way, or quickly and in a disorderly way via bankruptcies. And I would bet, based on how previous bubbles have blown up, that it's quickly via bankruptcy.
John, what do you have to say to somebody that could be watching this that has a house that they've been thinking about selling, as someone that wrote the book on the housing market crash, and you write a Substack? We'll talk about that. I mentioned it in your intro before we got started here. All of your links are in the show notes below. I highly encourage people to check John out and subscribe to his Substack. I do, and look forward to his emails that he sends out. It's always an interesting read and always seems timely to what's going on. So I appreciate your research on that. Somebody that is looking and they're saying, look, they're hearing what you're saying about the potential for inventory to just increase in the market, flood the market rather rapidly. It could happen with the factors that we've discussed. But we're hearing a lot of other talk, and I'm starting to hear sellers that are saying, well, um, I'm thinking about selling. I'll need to sell within the next 6 or 8 or 10 months or whatever. But all of this talk about interest rates dropping, and you watch this unfold before back in the '08 crisis where they drop rates. They're saying, you know what, the pressure is going to be down on lowering these rates no matter what form it comes in, whether the government buys more mortgage-backed securities or its own debt, whatever it is, prints a bunch of money. And the rates for mortgages go down as a result of the 10-year Treasury. What do you tell these sellers? Are they smart for waiting, even if they're just waiting until the spring? Or is that the wrong way to think?
Well, I would say he who panics first panics best in this kind of a situation. Get out. This is going to be so messy and so ugly. And one of the reasons why is that, like you said, a lot of people are expecting lower interest rates in the year ahead. And that may not be possible this time around. For instance, the Fed already started cutting interest rates last September. And normally long-term rates go down along with short-term rates. They went up instead. The bond markets did not want any part of falling short-term interest rates. So this time around, when the Fed starts cutting interest rates, as they're going to do this month and probably each month for the rest of the year, we have to wonder what the bond market is going to do about this. Because if cutting interest rates, while inflation is above the Fed's target, while unemployment is very low still, apparently, while home prices are at record levels, while stock prices are at bubble levels, highest they've ever been, cutting rates into that kind of a market can be very inflationary. And if that's the case, that means the value of the dollar is going to fall hard, and you do not want to own a bond portfolio then. So the bond markets will react by pushing up interest rates. And then the government will have to step in and try to specifically force down long-term interest rates, which they may not succeed at because the bond market is very big and it does not like inflation. So if interest rates were to go up at the long end of the spectrum, even if it was just for a few months, and that took mortgages up to, let's say, 8% or even 9%, because that's completely feasible if the 10-year Treasury yield jumps from here. That might just crash the housing market, because if you got 8% mortgages, then the people who could barely buy that starter house with a 6% and change mortgage are priced out, and the price has to come down. So you're looking at that kind of an environment potentially. It could be that the government succeeds in pushing down long-term interest rates without inflation, but you don't want to bet your finances on that happening. If you can get a halfway decent price for your house now, do that, and then just step back. Then you no longer have the kind of stress that you'll have while the government is working out its monetary policy and the bond market is deciding what it's going to do. So yeah, I would advise, if you're a buyer, wait. If you're a seller, do not wait.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I mean, if rates do somehow, the long-term, bond rate pushes down mortgages, you may see that pent-up seller demand unleash. And then the inventory, where right now inventory is still very tight for highly desirable properties. I mean, a lot of the properties that are on the market right now they're priced high for houses that need a lot of work. I mean, we're seeing that. And people are like, oh my gosh, they want, $500,000 for this house, but it needs so much. It needs a new kitchen. It needs new bathrooms. It needs so much. Where if rates do drop, you may see a massive uptick in inventory, which again may have a negative effect on home prices, as these buyers will be more choosy to what house they will pick.
Yeah. There are a lot of different ways for house prices to fall in the coming year, and very few ways that are feasible for them to rise, because they're already at the very far end of unaffordability that they've ever been. This is as unaffordable as houses have ever been. So betting your peace of mind, let alone your money, on houses going up from here it's historically a bad bet. When they get this unaffordable, the prices fall. That's just how it's always happened. Or mortgage rates fall really, really dramatically. And it's conceivable. It could happen, but it's a low percentage bet. So, if I had a house I was thinking about selling, I would just not want to place the bet of waiting for things to get even better in terms of house prices. I would just talk to the broker, the realtor, and say, listen, see what you can do. I'll entertain offers, and let's move this thing.
Yeah. Not a time to be greedy. John Rubino, always a pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Todd. Always fun to talk to you.
We'll talk to you soon. Hey guys, I just wanted to take a brief minute and share some exciting news. I have just released my new Todd Simple home buying course. This course is designed for anyone wanting to know how to buy a home. It's designed to take you through the entire home buying process from start to finish. You'll learn how to represent yourself should you want to avoid paying real estate commissions, the best ways to shop for a home, how to avoid costly mistakes, what to look for when touring a home, negotiation tactics, and so much more. In this home buying course, I hold nothing back. In fact, I would go to say that no one has uncovered the home buying process like I have. I've even made a way for you to gift this course to your family and friends. Visit saxrealty.education. The link is also pinned in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, you can let us know by smashing that thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please consider doing so now. Hit that alert bell. You'll know every time we upload content just like this. Keep those comments and questions coming. And one of the biggest compliments you can do for us all here at Sachs Realty is to share our channel and this video with your family and friends. This will help us to continue to build this amazing online community with viewers just like yourself. See you next time. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.